There is a particular kind of silence that arrives just after laughter. Not the warm silence of a joke that has landed well and settled into the room, like good music, the kind that people exhale into, shoulders dropping, the tension of anticipation finally released, but the other kind, entirely. The cold, sharp, deliberate silence that follows when someone has laughed at you and everyone present has heard it, and the moment has stretched just long enough that the possibility of anyone stepping forward to say something in your defense has quietly expired. That is the silence Marcus Hale knew better than most people know their own names. He had lived inside it for years. He had learned its texture, the way you learn the feel of a room in the dark, by moving through it slowly, repeatedly, until your hands know every wall without needing to see them. He had learned the temperature of it, the particular way it pressed against the chest, like a palm flat against a door, patient and immovable, holding you back from a room you were never quite invited into. And on the evening of Eleanor Whitfield's 70th birthday celebration, standing in the open doorway of the Whitfield family home, with the warm light of the entrance hall falling across the front path and the sound of a string quartet drifting from somewhere deep in the house, Marcus felt that silence arrive again, as familiar as an old wound, and just as sharp and carrying all the same message it had always carried. You are here, you are seen, and what we see does not impress us. He should not have been there at all. That was the honest thing about it. Most men in his position, with his history in that house and his particular relationship to the family that lived inside it, would have declined the invitation entirely. They would have sent a card, perhaps a gift, and they would have spent the evening somewhere that did not require them to be measured against a standard that had been calibrated specifically to exclude them. But Marcus was not most men in that particular way, and the invitation had not been a casual one. His ex-wife Diane had called him 3 weeks before the party, with a voice that carried the slight, careful exhaustion of someone who had already argued this point with someone else and lost. She had called from what sounded like the kitchen of the house she now shared with Gareth, and there had been the ambient sounds of that life behind her. Cupboards, the low murmur of a television, the orderly background noise of a household that had organized itself without reference to Marcus Hale. "Mother wants you there," she had said, not warmly, but not coldly, either, with the measured neutrality of someone delivering a message they have agreed to deliver and intend to deliver accurately. "She specifically asked for you by name. You know how she is about her guest list. Once she's decided something, there's no point." Marcus had known. Eleanor Whitfield was a woman who treated her social arrangements the way a field general treats a campaign, with precision, with deliberate intention, and with an absolute intolerance for the kind of casual deviation that other people might call flexibility. Her guest lists were not suggestions, they were architecture. If Eleanor had decided that Marcus Hale belonged at her 70th birthday celebration, then Marcus Hale belonged there, and the feelings of everyone else present about this determination were noted and filed and did not change the determination. That was simply how Eleanor operated. And it was one of the things Marcus had always respected about her, even on the evenings when that same decisive quality had been directed at outcomes he found less agreeable. So he had come. He had driven 40 minutes from his apartment in the city, the apartment he had moved into 2 years ago, after the marriage ended, a clean and well-proportioned space that he had slowly, carefully made into something that felt genuinely like his, and he had parked his sedan 3 houses down the street because the driveway and the direct frontage were already crowded with vehicles whose cost spoke clearly about the kind of evening this was going to be. He had walked up the front path in the early evening light, a bottle of wine tucked under his arm, the kind of wine that he knew to be excellent but that wore no label recognizable enough to perform its own quality to a stranger. He had straightened his jacket at the door. He had taken one full breath, the kind you take not to calm yourself, but to remind yourself of the dimensions of who you actually are, separate from what a particular room is about to try to tell you. And then he had stepped into the doorway. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. If you have ever stood in a room where you were fully visible to every person in it and still somehow managed to feel invisible, if you have ever felt the specific exhaustion of being assessed and found wanting by people who did not take the time to actually look, then I want you to tap that like button right now. Because this story is for you, and you should know that from the start. If you're new here, please subscribe, because we tell stories like this every week, and every one of them is worth your time. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I am always genuinely curious, and the community in those comments is something real. Now, let's go back to that doorway where Marcus Hale is standing with a bottle of wine and the particular dignity of a man who has decided in advance that he will not be diminished tonight, regardless of what the evening attempts. Diane saw him first. She was positioned near the entrance hall in the natural gathering place that forms in every party, that zone just past the threshold where people collect before they commit to any particular room or conversation. She was standing with her sister Petra and two men Marcus recognized as professional colleagues of Diane's partner, Gareth, a corporate attorney, whose name Marcus had first encountered in the context of his divorce and who had since become a fixture of the Whitfield family's social architecture. These two men had the careful, polished ease of people accustomed to rooms like this one, and they were mid-conversation when Marcus appeared in the doorway. Diane looked at him the way people look at a piece of furniture that has been moved slightly from where they expected to find it, not alarmed, not pleased, simply registering the presence, with the mild, inconvenienced surprise of someone whose mental arrangement of the room has just been disrupted. Her eyes moved. They moved with the calibrated deliberateness of someone who has decided to conduct an inventory and is in no hurry to complete it. Up from his face, across his jacket, down to his trousers, and then, with the specific, unhurrying intention of a point being made slowly enough to be unmistakable, to his shoes. They were not bad shoes. He wanted to be clear about that, even in his own mind, because he had learned a long time ago the value of accurate self-assessment as a counterweight to other people's inaccurate ones. They were dark and clean and well-maintained, the shoes of a man who takes care of what he owns and wears things until they have earned their retirement rather than replacing them on the schedule that appearances demand. They were not Italian leather with the particular subdued gleam of very serious money. They were not the shoes of someone performing membership in the Whitfield world. They were honest. They were practical. And in the specific moral grammar of the Whitfield family, in which honest and practical, when applied to a man who had once been married to their daughter and had not subsequently distinguished himself in ways they could verify, amounted to a kind of confession, they were apparently damning. Diane's mouth curved. It was a small, precise movement. She leaned slightly toward Petra, and what she said next was delivered at a volume that was a masterpiece of social calibration, not loud enough to constitute an open statement, not quiet enough to constitute a private one. It was the exact volume required for Marcus to hear it, for Petra to hear it, for both of Gareth's colleagues to catch it, and for the Whitfield's housekeeper, who was managing a small collection of coats near the door, to receive it as background information she would remember. "He wore those shoes," Diane said, and then she laughed, not a sharp or vicious laugh, which would have been easier to absorb and easier to dismiss, but something far more effective, a light, airy, musical laugh. The laugh of someone who finds a thing so comprehensively beneath the level of serious consideration that even mockery feels like an overinvestment. Petra looked at the shoes. Her expression moved through examination into the small, compressed satisfaction of someone who has been waiting with patience for an opportunity that has now arrived neatly gift-wrapped. "Bless him," she said, which is a phrase that has no meaning in the English language except as a vehicle for contempt that is trying to pass itself off as generosity. Marcus stood in that silence. He held the bottle of wine. He looked at Diane for exactly as long as felt honest, which was roughly the duration of a single breath, and she met his eyes for perhaps 1 second before her gaze moved on with the casual facility of someone who has already processed the moment and moved to the next thought. He was 38 years old. He had been divorced from Diane for 2 years. He had spent 3 of the 4 years of their marriage attempting, in various careful and then increasingly exhausted ways, to be enough for a family that had made its determination about him before they ever properly met him, and had never seriously revisited it. And he was standing in the doorway of a party that would not be happening tonight. Not in this house, not with these extraordinary flowers filling every room, not with the string quartet whose sound was threading through from the garden, not with the catering that guests would later describe as the finest food they'd eaten at a private occasion in years. Not with a wine that was, without exception, superior to anything Diane or Petra had thought to select. If not for him, that was the thing. That was the specific, layered, extraordinary irony of the moment. Diane did not know it. Petra did not know it. The 2 colleagues did not know it. The entire room, full of people who had looked at Marcus Hale and completed their assessments, did not know it. The only people who knew it were Marcus himself, and somewhere deeper in that beautifully arranged house, Eleanor Whitfield, who had known it for months, who had been sitting with the knowledge, the way you sit with something genuinely valuable, waiting for exactly the right moment to place it where it would do its full work. If you can feel the dramatic irony building in this story, if you can feel the gap between what the room believes and what is actually true, pressing against the scene like water behind a dam, then you are paying attention, and you should be. Every thread in this story was placed deliberately. Stay with it. 3 months before Eleanor's birthday, Marcus had been at his desk in the architectural consulting firm he had spent the past 2 years building from nothing into something that had recently begun to attract the kind of attention that serious, visible work eventually attracts whether you pursue the attention or not. The firm occupied proper offices, now with 11 people whose salaries Marcus met without drama and whose work he was genuinely proud of. He had a view of the city from his desk that he had not arranged for its symbolism, but that carried it regardless. He had been reviewing drawings for a waterfront commission that was, if it concluded as it was trending, going to be the largest project his firm had ever undertaken. The kind of commission that does not stay invisible, that attaches your name to something that will stand in a city for decades and be seen by everyone who passes it. He had been working for 3 hours without looking up when his phone lit, with Eleanor's name. He had looked at it for a moment before answering. Eleanor Whitfield's calls always produced in him a particular mixture of warmth and the kind of careful attention you bring to things that matter. Whatever the Whitfield family's collective position on Marcus Hale, Eleanor had always operated differently. She had looked at him with the direct, unhurried clarity of a woman who has spent 70 years developing an accurate eye for people and has no interest in adjusting her assessments to match the room's preferred conclusions. She had, in her precise and private way, made sure he knew she saw him, not in grand declarations, but in the small, consistent ways that actually mean something. A question about a project that told him she had been listening the last time. A comment that acknowledged his intelligence rather than routing around it. A steadiness of regard that did not waver based on whatever the family's current temperature about him happened to be. The call was brief and entirely characteristic. Eleanor was turning 70. She wanted a gathering that felt real. Not the kind of corporate-grade social performance that Diane and Petra tended to produce when given primary responsibility for events, which was always beautifully executed and completely impersonal, but something that reflected the actual texture of her life and the people who had genuinely inhabited it. She had intended to manage the arrangements herself, but her health had been presenting some challenges. Nothing serious, she said, with the brisk, non-negotiable dignity of a woman who does not speak about her difficulties for sympathy. Simply that the logistics of an event this size were beyond what she felt comfortable absorbing alongside other demands. She had a budget figure in mind. She wanted to know whether Marcus would be willing to oversee the arrangements. As a gift, she was careful to say, not as a service, not a commission, a gift from someone whose judgment she trusted and whose care she counted on. He had said yes before she finished the word gift. In the weeks that followed, he had exceeded her stated budget by a factor of approximately 3, funding the difference entirely himself through a series of decisions that were made not as strategy and not as setup, but as the natural consequence of a man who, when he takes something on, takes it on completely. The flowers that filled the Whitfield home on the evening of the party, those deep, extravagant arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus and trailing greenery that made the rooms feel like somewhere time had agreed to slow down, Marcus had researched, sourced, specified, and paid for. The catering company whose food was currently producing the kind of quiet, concentrated appreciation in guests that good food always produces had been identified by Marcus through 3 rounds of tastings he had attended himself and evaluated seriously. The string quartet had been booked by Marcus. The wine had been selected by Marcus. The lighting in the garden that threw the roses into that pale ceremonial glow through the tall windows had been specified by Marcus on one of the 2 separate weekends. He had driven out to the property to walk the space and think about how it could be made into something worthy of the woman who lived in it. He had coordinated with Eleanor's personal assistant twice a week for 10 weeks. He had managed vendor confirmations and set up logistics and the half-dozen small crises that attend any event of this scale with the calm, systematic precision of someone who has learned to absorb complexity without distributing its weight onto the people around him. He had done all of this without once mentioning it to Diane, not out of any rehearsed concealment, not as part of a plan, but simply because Eleanor had asked that the arrangements remain between them until she chose to share them, and Marcus kept his word. That was not a complicated feature of his character. It was simply who he was. And now Diane was laughing at his shoes. He moved past her, past Petra, past the 2 colleagues who had observed the moment, and filed it away under whatever category they had designated for men whose shoes did not pass inspection at this particular address. He crossed the entrance hall and found Eleanor across the main room near the fireplace, at the center of a small, visibly delighted cluster of people who were positioned around her with the slightly leaning posture of people who want to be close to a source of warmth. Eleanor was 70 and had arrived at 70, the way some people arrive at destinations that have always been waiting for them, with an air of having fully earned the place, carrying with her a density of actual substance that made other people feel more substantial for being near it. She wore deep blue, the color catching the firelight. Her silver hair was set. When she looked across the room and found Marcus entering it, something in her expression shifted with an immediacy that bypassed all the social mechanics and simply said, "Here is someone I am genuinely glad to see." She excused herself from her circle without hurry and came directly to him. She took both his hands in hers the way she always had, firmly, warmly, with the complete attentiveness of someone who is entirely present in a greeting rather than executing it while thinking about the next thing. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried both the warmth of welcome and something else, something more focused and prepared, the quality of a woman who has decided that tonight certain things will be said and who is moving with purpose towards saying them. "You look well. And this party, Marcus. I have been stopping people all evening. I have been telling everyone who will listen. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." "It was entirely my honor," he said, and the completeness with which he meant it surprised even him slightly, the way genuine feelings sometimes do when they surface in the middle of moments that are also performing other work. She held his gaze for a moment with the direct assessing attention she brought to everything. "I know it was," she said. and then just perceptibly louder than the exchange had been before, a calibration as deliberate as Diane's had been, but in the opposite direction entirely. She said, "I was just about to say a few words to the room. I hope you'll stay near the front. I want people to be able to see you properly." When I do, Diane was 12 feet away. Marcus could see, in the periphery of his attention, the fractional recalibration of her posture, the small, controlled physical adjustment of someone who has received a piece of information they did not expect and is rapidly and quietly assessing its implications. He said nothing. He smiled at Eleanor, and she pressed his hands once and turned toward the room. The years since the divorce had not been simple, and Marcus had not expected them to be. He had taken almost nothing from the settlement, not because he was legally required to leave with nothing, but because he had not wanted the next part of his life to begin with anything that had been argued over. He had walked out of the marriage with the specific lightness of someone who has put down a very heavy thing and is noticing, with mild surprise, how much freer their hands are. He had moved into his apartment. He had opened his firm in the immediate aftermath in a studio he rented by the month, with one contract and a contact list, and the kind of relentless private competence that does not announce itself, but also does not stop. The ambient message of his marriage had been consistent. Marcus was not quite the right caliber, not for the Whitfields, not by implication for the world they occupied. He was competent, certainly. Diane had never disputed that, but competence in the Whitfield vocabulary was a baseline rather than a distinction. The family moved in a register where competence was assumed, and what mattered was the performance of belonging, the visible display of status and ease, and the particular fluency that comes from having grown up, knowing exactly which room you are supposed to be in. Marcus had not grown up knowing that. He had grown up knowing that you build the room, and those were not the same education. What he had built, clean and from almost nothing, over the 2 years since the marriage ended was by any honest external measure remarkable. 11 employees. Projects in 4 cities. A reputation in the professional architecture community that had been assembled the slow, legitimate way, through work that was good enough to be spoken about by the people who received it, rather than through the social engineering that accelerates some careers and makes them permanently fragile. The Waterfront Commission currently on his desk was the clearest signal yet of this trajectory, and when its announcement ran in the coming weeks, it would not be the quiet inside-the-industry news that his previous work had been. It would be the kind of news that reaches people who do not follow architecture, because the buildings would be visible, the scale would be significant, and the name attached to them would be printed in the kind of publications that the Whitfield world reads over Saturday breakfast. None of this was known to Diane. They communicated occasionally, by text, about the residual administrative details of a finished marriage, a piece of forwarded mail, a confirmation that an old account had been properly closed. She had not asked about his work in 2 years, and he had not offered information about it. This was not a strategy. It was simply the natural silence that forms between two people who have genuinely moved into separate lives. He wished her nothing bad. He simply no longer thought about her very much, which was, he had come to understand, the truest measure of having actually moved on. Not the dramatic declarations of indifference, but the genuine quietness of thoughts that have found other things to occupy them. Gareth had assessed Marcus at their few points of necessary overlap with the efficient, permanent confidence of a man accustomed to making fast evaluations and not revisiting them. He had determined Marcus to be unremarkable in the ways that mattered to Gareth's particular system of measurement, had filed that assessment, and had moved on. It was, Marcus reflected without particular heat, the most common mistake that self-certain people make, the assumption that a quick reading is a complete one, and that what is not immediately visible does not exist. Inside the party, the evening built its warmth in the way that well-arranged evenings do, steadily, genuinely, without the performative peaks that good catering and good wine produce when the underlying gathering is hollow. The food was, as Marcus had spent 3 tastings ensuring it would be genuinely extraordinary. The string quartet moved through its program with the specific ease of musicians who are being listened to, which changes what they play. People moved through the rooms with the loosened, grateful ease that arrives in the later part of an evening when the formality has dissolved and what remains is simply the pleasure of being somewhere good. Marcus spoke with Eleanor's friends, several of whom he had met during the marriage, and who greeted him now with the uncomplicated pleasure of people who had liked him then and had not adjusted that liking to conform to whatever the family's subsequent narrative had been. He spoke at length with Eleanor's oldest friend, Constance, a woman in her late 60s, with the kind of direct, appreciative warmth that makes a room feel more hospitable simply by her being in it, who took his arm in both hands and told him that Eleanor had been quietly glowing about the arrangements for weeks, and that she hoped he understood what it had meant to her. He said he did. He found, to his own quiet interest, that he did. Diane watched him. He felt the recalibrated quality of her attention without seeking it out, the specific register of someone who has revised their initial read of a situation and is now conducting a more careful observation. Petra, less disciplined in concealing this kind of adjustment, appeared at his elbow during a pass near the bar with the practiced pleasantness of someone who has decided to fish for information under the social cover of casual conversation. "So are you still doing the architecture thing?" she asked, with that particular lightness of tone that people use when they wish to convey that a thing is not serious enough to require its proper name. "Still doing it," Marcus said, with the same pleasant unconcern. "It's going very well." He offered no further detail. He had not needed Petra's comprehension of his career when they were family, and he found he needed it considerably less now. Said Petra, in the way that people say it when the response they received was not the one they were hoping for. She drifted, as people who fish without catching always do. Gareth made a single pass through Marcus's vicinity with the easy, unconscious dominance of someone who does not register territory as territory, because they have never seriously competed for any of it. He offered Marcus the brief terminal nod of acknowledgement, the kind that grants presence without significance, and moved toward the bar with the smooth decisiveness of someone who knows exactly what they want and expects to receive it. Marcus nodded in return. Neither of them required more than that, and the transaction was complete in under 4 seconds. The room was full and warm. Through the tall windows, the garden held its night in the illuminated pale of the lights Marcus had specified, the roses catching them and returning a soft, almost ceremonial brightness, white against the dark. Eleanor moved through her guests with the unhurried ease of a woman entirely at home in her own occasion, and she was happy. Not performed happy, not graciously enduring her birthday. Happy, but genuinely, fully, uncomplicatedly happy in the way that people are when the world around them for one particular evening has been made to match something true about who they are. The specific satisfaction Marcus felt at this, at having made that possible, at having had the privilege of doing it, was the cleanest feeling he had experienced in a very long time. And then Eleanor moved to the center of the room. She did it without announcement, without the staged clearing of a throat, or the raised glass, or any of the theatrical apparatus by which people usually claim a room's attention. She simply moved to the natural center of the space, the point that the architecture of the room itself suggested, which Marcus had noticed when he walked the property months ago, and she stood there and waited, with the still, unhurried authority of a woman who has never once in her life needed to raise her voice to be heard. The conversations around her settled in sequence, one cluster finding the quiet, and then the next, like a sound passing through water. Within 30 seconds, the room was entirely hers. "I won't speak for long," Eleanor began, and there was genuine laughter because Eleanor's friends knew her, and this was, as they understood, an aspiration she would attempt in good faith and not quite achieve. She smiled, acknowledging this without apology. But I will say what is true. And what is true is that I have been given an extraordinary evening. This house is beautiful tonight. In a way, I have not seen it before. The food has been extraordinary. The music has been exactly right. And the care, the specific, deliberate, generous care that has gone into every detail of this gathering is something I have been aware of from the moment I came downstairs this afternoon and saw what had been made here. She paused, and the pause had the weight of someone moving from the preamble to the point. My daughters have been present through the preparations, and they have contributed in their ways, and I love them for it, as I always do. Diane received this with the composed smile of public acknowledgement, Petra's fingertips pressed together. But there is something I want to be clear about, Eleanor continued, and the register of her voice had shifted only slightly, but enough that the room absorbed the shift and paid a different quality of attention. This was no longer the warm, gracious thank you. This was the thing she had stood up to say. When I decided that I wanted this evening to be something real, something that reflected my actual life and the people who have genuinely mattered to me, I turned to someone whose judgment I trust completely and without reservation. Someone who took the small, simple vision I described to him and transformed it into this. Her eyes found Marcus across the gathered room with the precision of a woman who has known where he was standing the entire time. Marcus, would you come here, please? The room turned, not in fragments or gradually, but collectively, the unified, instinctive turn of a crowd being shown something that reorganizes their understanding of the space they are all sharing. Marcus moved through the people, and they made room for him without being asked. The small, automatic courtesy that groups extend to someone they have just learned to see differently. He came to stand beside Eleanor, and she took his arm in both hands and turned with him to face the room. Every flower you are looking at tonight was chosen and placed on Marcus's instruction. The catering you have been enjoying, the music you have been hearing, the wine in your glass, all of it was coordinated, arranged, and in very substantial part funded by this man as a gift to me, because he understood what I wanted better than almost anyone I know. She looked up at him briefly, with a direct warmth that she had never learned to dilute or manage. He has been quietly extraordinary for as long as I have known him, and I have known him long enough to say that with complete confidence. Quiet is simply the register he operates in. It is not the register in which he should be discussed by anyone who is actually paying attention. The last sentence fell into the room without a raised voice, without a glance toward any particular person. It did not need either. It had a specific address, and everyone in the room understood that, and the people it was addressed to understood it most clearly of all. The applause was immediate and genuine, the kind that comes from a crowd that has just been shown something they were not expecting and are responding to, with the uncomplicated pleasure of a surprise that turns out to be good. People who Marcus had spoken with earlier in the evening, who had known him simply as Eleanor's former son-in-law, a pleasant and somewhat unremarkable presence at the edge of the occasion, were now recalibrating everything they had observed about him over the previous hours with the new information that he had built the occasion itself. The flowers they were standing among, the food they had just described to each other as extraordinary, the lights in the garden, the roses through the window. All of it had come through his hands, his attention, his care, his money, given freely and without announcement to a woman who deserved to be celebrated properly. Marcus thanked Eleanor quietly, and she squeezed his arm once, with the satisfied certainty of someone who has placed the last piece of something they have been building for a long time and seen it land exactly where it was meant to. He turned to face the room, and in that turn he found Diane. She was standing perhaps 12 feet away, positioned where she had drifted during Eleanor's speech, without quite realizing how close she had come. The social composure she maintained in public, the smooth, presentation-ready expression that Marcus had watched her sustain through 4 years of marriage across dozens of occasions that required it, had not fully broken. But something had gone out of it. The specific, confident light behind it, the light of someone who knows exactly where they stand in the room and finds that location comfortable, had dimmed, and what remained was the effortful quality of a face working carefully to present an expression that its owner no longer entirely feels. Her eyes were level and her jaw was set in the precise, fractional way that Marcus recognized because he had seen it exactly once before. On the night she told him she wanted a divorce, and he had simply said, "All right," with a steadiness she had clearly not anticipated, and she had not known what to do with the absence of the reaction she had expected. And that same fractional setting of the jaw had appeared then too in the gap between what she had prepared for and what had arrived. Petra had managed the pretense less successfully. Her expression had moved through surprise and was now attempting to settle into nonchalance with the visible effort of someone making a journey toward a destination they are not sure they will reach. Gareth, to his considerable credit, was wearing the clean, controlled expression of a man who has recalibrated and is doing so without requiring the adjustment to be observed by anyone. Marcus did not hold eye contact with Diane for longer than the moment required. He turned to Constance, who had appeared at his shoulder with the energized, affectionate warmth of someone who has witnessed something wonderful and has things to say about it in detail. And immediately she said them. He received them with genuine warmth because he liked Constance, and her appreciation was real, and he was not too proud or too composed to be moved by things that were real. Other guests came to him in the following minutes. Eleanor's neighbors, the members of her book club, a man named Douglas who had known Eleanor for 40 years, and who took Marcus's hand and held it for a moment before saying that this was the finest thing he had seen anyone do for Eleanor in all the years he had known her, and that he meant that. Marcus thanked him and meant the thanks. He was not gloating. This was the critical, irreducible fact about what he was doing. He had not arranged Eleanor's party as a scheme. He had not funded the flowers and the catering and the music as a setup for this moment. He had done those things because Eleanor Whitfield had been kind to him in a sustained and genuine way across years when kindness from that family had not been abundant, and because she was turning 70 and deserved to feel genuinely celebrated rather than efficiently managed. The moment that had just occurred was not something he had engineered. It was something that had arrived as a natural consequence of who he was and what he had chosen to do. And those two things were not the same as a strategy. He had learned this in the 2 years since the divorce. The exact and important difference between justice and revenge. Revenge was something you constructed in order to wound people who had wounded you. Justice was something that accumulated quietly while you were simply living correctly. And that arrived when it arrived, not because you had arranged for it, but because you had not deviated from who you were long enough for the truth to surface on its own. 40 minutes after Eleanor's speech, when the party had moved into its later ease, and the conversations had loosened, and the string quartet had found a quieter, more self-contained register, Diane found him near the garden door. He was standing at the tall glass, looking out at the illuminated roses, the garden holding its dark around them in that particular way of late evenings in early autumn. Diane came to stand beside him with the measured, deliberate approach of someone who has been working toward a thing for a while and has finally decided to do it. They stood for a moment in silence. It was oddly comfortable. The specific, complicated comfort of two people who had shared enough of a life to have learned each other's silences without having learned enough of the more important things. The silence had been one of the few true skills of their marriage. It had also, he thought now, been one of the symptoms of its failure. They had become too practiced at not saying the things that needed to be said until the things that needed to be said were no longer sayable. "I didn't know," Diane said finally. She said it plainly, without the defensive architecture that she sometimes erected around admissions that cost her, just the plain statement given without framing. "I know you didn't," he said. Outside, One of the garden lights caught the full face of a white rose and held it pale, clean, entirely itself against the dark. "She didn't tell us any of it," Diane said. "We thought she had handled it herself, or that Constance had helped with the arrangements." "I know." A pause. "Why didn't you say anything? When I called to invite you, why didn't you just tell me?" Marcus considered this with the honesty it deserved. "Because your mother asked me to keep it between us until she decided to share it. Because I gave her my word, and I keep my word. And because—" He stopped, finding the next words with care, the care of someone who has thought about this for a long time and wants to say it accurately, because it wasn't about being known for it, it was about doing it. Those are different things, and I think the difference matters more than most people give it credit for. Diane was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than the pauses before it. Not the practiced quiet of two people managing their distance, but the genuine quiet of someone sitting with something they have just been told and finding to their own slight surprise that it means something to them. "I was unkind to you," she said, "earlier, by the door." "Yes," he said, "not with heat, not with accumulated grievance, not as the opening of a longer indictment, simply as a statement of accurate fact, offered without decoration. I'm sorry." He looked at her. Then, this woman he had loved and tried with and ultimately could not reach, and who had ultimately not reached for him in the ways that would have made the reaching reciprocal. She looked, in this specific moment, less like the composed and defended version of herself that she generally presented to the world, and more like a person, someone slightly smaller than her posture suggested, standing in the garden light of a party she had not made, apologizing to a man she had not seen clearly. He received the apology. He did not return it with added weight. He did not open it into a longer conversation about the doorway, or the shoes, or the 4 years, or any of the rest of it. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it as a genuine close. He moved back into the warmth of the house, found Eleanor sitting with Constance near the fireplace, both of them deep in the full-bodied, unguarded laughter of two people who have known each other for long enough that nothing needs to be performed between them. He sat with them for a good while, accepting a glass of wine he had selected months ago in a room very different from this one, which gave him a private, entirely contained amusement that he kept completely to himself. He stayed through the late warmth of the evening, through the grateful, reluctant departures that mark the end of something that was genuinely good and that its participants are unwilling to fully concede. He said goodnight to Constance, who held his hands briefly and said to come and find her at the next gathering, without qualification. He said goodnight to Douglas, who shook his hand with the firm brevity of someone who has already said what they meant to say and does not need to repeat it. At the coat station in the hallway, the Whitfields' housekeeper brought his coat with a look that contained a complete sentence she had clearly decided was not hers to speak aloud. It was legible in every detail of her expression. Regardless, he thanked her, and she nodded, and her nod said everything the sentence would have. Eleanor walked him to the door herself. She took his hands one last time. "You built tonight," she said. "Don't let anyone diminish that. Not now, not later, not in the way. Those things can be slowly diminished over time if you let people." "No one can," he said. "The things you actually build are real. They stay. You can stand in them, and you can point at them, and the people who were there can remember what it felt like to be inside something you made. That doesn't go anywhere." She studied him with the full weight of her attention, the intelligent, unhurried, genuinely curious attention that she had brought to him from the first time they properly spoke, years ago, in this same house, when he had been new to the family and uncertain of his welcome, and she had simply looked at him as though he were interesting and asked him a question about his work. That demonstrated she had actually listened the last time. "You are going to be all right," she said, and she said it not as comfort offered to someone struggling, but as a considered observation stated by a woman who has spent 70 years learning to read people accurately and has arrived at a conclusion she is prepared to stand behind. "I know," he said. He walked down the front path in the cool evening air in his honest shoes, and the night was clear, and the city was a low glow in the distance, and the street was quiet. His sedan was 3 houses down where he had parked it. Unremarkable, among the unremarkable cars at the ordinary end of the block. He got in. He drove. The windows were down slightly, and the air moved through the car, with the easy freedom of late hours in a city that has not quite gone to sleep. He thought about Eleanor, and about the way Constance laughed, and about the white roses standing in the garden light behind the tall windows of that house. He thought almost not at all about Diane, which was itself a form of information, the clearest signal he had received in some time that he had traveled without particularly noticing the distance or marking the journey considerably farther from that part of his life than he had known. 3 weeks after the party, the Waterfront Commission was confirmed, and the announcement ran. It appeared in the architecture press, as expected. It appeared in 2 of the city's general interest publications, somewhat more prominently than Marcus had anticipated. The photograph showed him at his desk. The text described the trajectory of the firm over 2 years, with the kind of specificity that comes from a journalist who has done the actual research, and what it described was, by any honest measure, remarkable reading for anyone who had encountered Marcus Hale in a different context and formed a different impression. Eleanor sent a message the morning the announcement appeared. 3 words, "There it is." He read it 3 times in his office, while the city moved outside his window, and he felt each reading differently, and all 3 correctly. Gareth sent a message, which arrived several days later, and which Marcus had not expected. It was professionally worded and precise, suggesting that his firm might be of interest to a client consortium. Gareth was currently advising and proposing an initial conversation. Marcus read it twice, considered it honestly, and replied with the same professionalism. He noted his firm's current capacity, acknowledged the potential interest, and said he would be glad to explore it when his schedule permitted and the fit seemed right. The restraint of this response was not maneuvering. He simply had 11 people doing serious work on a significant commission, and his first obligation was to them and to the quality of that work, and everyone else would wait for an honest opening in the calendar. That was simply how he operated. Diane sent no message about the announcement. He had not expected one, and when it did not come, he found that the absence of expectation was itself a kind of peace. The particular quiet of someone who no longer requires a specific response from a specific person in order to know how the day is going. They had said what there was to say at the garden door, with the party light warm behind them and the roses in the dark beyond the glass. Some conversations reach their actual end and do not require reopening. He wished her well in the ongoing abstract way that one can wish people well when you have genuinely removed yourself from the complicated territory of who they once were to you and arrived at the clean, neutral ground of simply being fine. Because he was fine, genuinely, sustainably, specifically fine, not the fine you say when someone asks and you do not want to explain, but the fine that lives in the actual texture of your days. The kind that does not depend on anyone else's revised opinion of you, because it was never constructed out of their opinions in the first place. The kind that lives in what you do when no one is measuring, in the excellence you bring to things that could accept less, in the promises you keep to people who trusted you before you were impressive enough to be worth trusting, in the rooms you build and the flowers you choose, and the evenings you make for people who saw you clearly when the people around them could not be troubled to try. There is something I want to sit with for a moment before we close tonight, because this story carries something worth keeping. The people who are laughing at your shoes are always in that moment telling you something precise about themselves. They are showing you exactly how they have decided to measure the world, what they count as worthiness, what they count as arrival, and those dimensions are almost always too small, and they will be too small long after you have moved past them. The question that matters has never been whether you are enough for their measurement. The question is whether you are building something real, whether the work you do in private matches the person you claim to be in public, whether the things you make will be standing when the people who laughed have moved on to laugh at something else. Marcus Hale was building something real. He had been for years. He did not need anyone to know it in order to continue. And that precise quality is the thing that makes a person actually unassailable. Not the announcement, not the commission, not the moment in the room when everyone turns. The years of work that made that moment true. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Standing in that doorway, holding the wine, hearing the laugh, would you have said something in that moment, or would you have held it the way he held it, carried the full weight of the irony, without once setting it down on someone else? I want to know your honest answer. Leave it in the comments, because the conversations that happen in this community are real ones, and they matter. And every response you leave makes this space larger and more worth being in for everyone who finds it. If this story landed for you tonight, please hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it does more for getting these stories to the people who need them than almost anything else you can do. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the stories ahead are worth being here for, and I don't want you to miss them. And wherever you are watching from tonight, whatever city, whatever country, whatever quiet room or late commute or ordinary Tuesday evening brought you to this particular video, I am genuinely glad you are here. The fact that you stayed until the end of this story says something about you that is not small. Marcus Hale drove home through the dark in his honest shoes, and somewhere behind him a party was ending in a house full of flowers he had chosen, lit by lights he had specified, warmed by food and wine and music he had arranged, and a woman who had seen him clearly for years was saying goodnight to her last guest with the full, settled happiness of someone who has been genuinely celebrated rather than merely organized. He had built that. It was real, and it would stay.